We'll continue our Memorial Day programming with journalist Gerald Nicosia, author of Home to War, The History of the Vietnam Veterans Movement. Next, Mr. Nicosia leads a discussion with veteran activists on their experiences after they returned from the war. It's about an hour and 35 minutes and is this week's feature in our continuing series of books on history.
If I could have your attention for a few minutes, we're going to introduce the author in a few words. I was wondering if everyone could come. We have C-SPAN covering us, and we need to do props, believe it or not. So we're not used to that being activists. So if we could set ourselves from where this gentleman's standing right here, and then work ourselves around, come closer, and Jerry will speak to you. And some of the people will be invited from the audience to say a few words about their activism days. There's no police here. There is immunity while you're in this room. So, but Mahoney and Friedman, you guys don't worry about it, so you can relax. Where David is, I see a lot of these guys here. Victor over here. I will introduce myself. I am David Christian. I'm mentioned in the book. I've known Jerry about, I guess, 15 years. I never thought this would come to fruition, his book. It's a phenomenal accomplishment. Those of you that are mentioned in the book, everyone in this room, and probably 1,000 more people have been mentioned in reference to the days of activism. I remember I worked with Senator John Kerry. We were walking down the hallway the other day, and he put his arm around me, and he said, we're chatting, and the hallway was empty in the Russell Building, a long, long hallway. And I said, John, you know, we came here in the 20s. You know, we were 20 years old. We started in Washington, D.C. I said, we were the kids, and we're no longer the kids. And he said, David, you mean we're no longer the young guys? And Dennis Rhodes was just sharing something with me, how he used to address audiences, and the audiences seemed to be disassociated with himself. He couldn't make a connection because they were all somewhat older than he, and he was a young veteran when he came to Washington. Now he makes a real connection to the audience. As his hair is grayed, but at least it's on his head. My hair has a way I have to keep turning it so it covers the whole forehead if I can there. But I see Danny out there, Freeman. Hopefully you haven't brought any blood. You're carrying a beer tonight. That's much better. But I want to mention a couple things about Jerry's book. I read his book again yesterday, the whole book I went through. And all of the people, all of you that are in that book, are heroes in your own way, in your own right. And yes, we did return home to a war. And I think it's a very appropriate title. And Jerry came to my office with his mother and an old beat-up car. And he was traveling across the country and he was interviewing people. At the time, I thought, this guy is never going to be able to finish this project. And he kept telling me that people were backing out and they weren't funding him and other people weren't financing him. And I'm thinking, God bless you, how you're going to do this. And yet, as I read the book and I saw how he thread the whole thing together, I think we can all agree and all share with the accolades, as you see, everything he's done here and captured the essence. And maybe some of people's names are a little bit displaced or disassociated with the actual essence of what you feel you've done, but it's really great that someone took 10 to 12, maybe 15 years of their life and put it into a book. And with that, this gentleman not only did that, but he captured your movement, your time. I happen to be born in the great state of Florida and hail from the city of Gainesville there, raised in Pennsylvania, so I know the Gainesville 8. I know everybody here in this room. And we're just 20 years older, that's all. And we still have the same fire in our belly and the same wonderful hearts to keep pumping. I have to apologize for my colleague, Senator John Kerry. John cannot be here tonight. He is running around. The Senate is out of session, and everyone schedules a senator for 7 or 8 different things. Logistically, it's hard to get from Massachusetts to here in the same evening. Also, Senator Max Cleland, who's mentioned in the book prominently, as well as John Kerry being mentioned in the book prominently. Both were activists in their own way, in their own time during those days. They both share their apologies. We do have a congressman with us who I've shared the dais with in the Quad City areas a number of times, Congressman Lane Evans. I don't know where he is. He's right behind me. No wonder I can't see him. So he is a superstar. And what I would like to do, I would like to introduce the congressman for 1 second. He is a champion of veterans' rights, a champion of our cause. He's one of the people that are left here. If you remember, as we started out, there were a few people that came and joined us here on the Hill. And during that period of time, he was a young boy. And you can see that he's working hard. He's still a young boy. So if you get a job here and it pays your bills, you can stay young. So I'd like to introduce the young Congressman, Lane Evans. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. I don't know if John Lopez is still with us, but talking about getting older, I was in his office talking to him and one of his assistants, and he got talking about how he got out of the Marine Corps the year that I was born. Actually, I said, "That's the year I was born, John." And then his assistant said, "Well, the year I was born, you got discharged from the Marine Corps." So it's I don't know where all the years have gone, but I'm very honored to be included in this book, Jerry. It's a great piece of work, and quite a high honor for me to be included. The more you get seniority around this place, so the more bits you get in books and so forth, and I appreciate it very much. And but I hope I'm not like some of the guys here who first get the book to look at the index to see if they're mentioned in the index as well. So we have a story that has now been told. 7 million people served in the military during the Vietnam era. Their story up until this year, I don't know how many years this is, about 30 plus years, has not been told until now. And we've got a great book here, and we wish you the best here. I don't know if you're going on a road tour. How many cities? On your road trip? Yeah.
Quite a few cities: Chicago, New York, Boston.
Okay.
Down the West Coast where I live. So yeah, I'll be at a lot of cities on this.
This I'm told is sometimes the most grueling part of the process, going from city to city, and radio programs and television interviews. So good luck.
It's easier than writing a book, let me tell you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. And with that, I think we should welcome the star of the evening here, and the new veterans activist, Gerald Nicosia. I hope I pronounced your name properly. So please join the audience and share with us your thoughts on how you did this history.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. This is the official launch of the book. It isn't even in the bookstore yet, but it'll be in the bookstores next week. But this is kind of like the very first event, so I really appreciate having you all here, and a lot of you are people in the book. So special thanks, of course, to John Kerry for making this evening possible, to David Wade, who works out of John's office, who's done a lot of work on making this happen, to Dave Christian, of course, for his work in making this happen and for his help all the way along the way. And you may be interested to know that the food tonight was provided by John Densmore of The Doors. Seriously, who has been a veterans advocate and supporter all of his life and likes to donate money to good causes. So John's a friend of mine and the drummer from The Doors, and said, yeah, I'd like to provide some food for those people. So he wrote a check. So the next time you buy a Doors record, you'll know you're supporting veterans causes. But anyway, I spent 12 years on this book, writing it, putting it together, fighting the publishing business to get it put out. It got canceled 3 times. This is the 4th publisher. But I want to make it very clear that this book isn't just, I mean, this reception isn't just about me. It's about the veterans movement itself and what I wrote about. And I want to make a special dedication of this evening at the start of what I'm going to say to 3 veterans who couldn't be here tonight because of their health. One is Frank McCarthy, who was one of the great people who worked to get Agent Orange compensation, and he's now has cancer himself, which well may be from Agent Orange, and he's, I believe, undergoing surgery today or tomorrow. and wanted to be here and couldn't be here. The second dedication is to a longtime friend of mine and big helper of Ron Kovic, a guy named Bobby Waddell, Vietnam veteran, Air Force, Saigon, who now has critical liver damage from hepatitis C. And as probably a lot of you know in this room, in the last few years, a huge number of Vietnam veterans have started manifesting hepatitis C. It's got a 30-year latency period, and people now feel there was some exposure in Vietnam that's causing this. And unfortunately, the VA hasn't made it widely enough known among Vietnam veterans that they need to go and get tested. And Bobby did not know and didn't get tested until he really fell very sick, and at that point his liver was critically damaged. If you catch hepatitis C early enough, you can go through the treatment. They say it's a bear of a treatment, but you can get well. Unfortunately, Bobby didn't get the treatment. He now needs a liver transplant or he will die. So he's in California and was not able to come. And the third dedication is to a Vietnam veteran, was a medic with the 1st Recon Marines, Danny Lateras, who is a wonderful writer, novelist, and poet of the Vietnam War, who has very, very serious heart problems. And there's a lot of thought now that there's even some connection with dioxin and heart problems. So Danny's problems may well have to do, plus delayed stress also is connected to heart problems. So I think that Danny's health may very well be a result of the war also. But I want to dedicate this evening to those three people who couldn't be here but would have liked to have been here. The reason I wrote this book was because of an incredible movement of men and women of my generation that had become forgotten and whose story I wanted to tell. These men and women served in the military during America's longest war. And they had been left, as Max Cleland said, holding the bag for a lost war. All of the negative feelings, as all of you know in this room, were that the country felt about the Vietnam War were put on the veterans of that war. Whether people were from the right or the left, the veterans got blamed always. And the anger and the feelings of a mistake, all of that was put on these people. And as many of you also know, veterans didn't even want to talk about the fact that they were veterans. They didn't want to tell people they were veterans just because of the negative reactions they kept getting over and over again. The men and women who came back from the Vietnam War had wounds that people couldn't see. They had delayed stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, Agent Orange health problems that were ticking away in their bodies. They might have looked healthy enough, but there were major disabilities that they had been given. Some, of course, like Ron Kovic or people that lost legs, their disabilities were visible, but a lot of the vets who came back, their disabilities were not visible. On top of that, on top of the things that were the actual wounds and the health wounds, of course, there was the scorn and the hatred of a lot of the nation toward them. And those things combined to make life very hard for a lot of returning Vietnam veterans. The veterans naturally looked to their government for help. It was natural. The government sent them to the war. The government should be the person that should be the agency that takes care of them afterward. What happened? Well, one thing that's interesting tonight is exactly the 30-year anniversary of an operation called Operation Dewey Canyon 3. 30 years ago today, over 1,000 Vietnam veterans came to Washington, D.C. to protest the war, to ask the government to stop the war, to throw their medals back on the steps of Congress, to say that they needed to be taken care of, because Operation Dewey Canyon 3, although the major thrust of it, of course, was to end the war, the vets were also talking at this time about delayed stress. They already had rap groups going with psychologists like Robert J. Lifton and Chaim Shatan. They knew there were psychological problems. There was already even talk about Agent Orange problems from the war. So although the thrust of that operation was to stop the war, to stop any more people from being hurt, the vets were also talking to Congress about taking care of us. You need to take care of us. Unfortunately, those words fell on deaf ears to a large extent. There were a few senators who listened to them, and one of them is here tonight, Mike Gravel. But by and large, they were not listened to. And they felt that the government was not going to be the answer. The government was not going to be the agency that took care of them. And of course, I should mention, which maybe you all know, that the person who led all those veterans, or one of the leaders of those veterans, is the person who sponsored this event tonight, John Kerry. And his first speech to Congress was as a young Vietnam veteran, come back from the war with a silver star and 3 Purple Hearts to tell the country that this war was wrong, and then people were losing their lives and losing their parts of their bodies for no reason, for no good reason. So the government turned its back on the Vietnam veterans. It tried to evict them from the mall when they were here. They camped out on the mall. Richard Nixon immediately went to court to get an order to remove them. The order was issued. It was taken to an appellate court, which turned it over and said the vets should be allowed to sleep on the mall. Other groups, the Poor People's March, had camped on the mall. It was like, why can't the veterans do it? So the appellate court said, yes, they can do it. Nixon got very angry and went to the Supreme Court and got the Supreme Court to overturn the appellate decision all in one day. It was supposedly the speediest decision on record to say that the vets could not sleep on the mall. And the vets held a vote very democratically, and they voted, and the majority said, we're going to sleep here. We fought and died for this country, for this piece of ground. We should have the right to sleep here. They stayed there. The police did not arrest them at all. The police said, we're not going to arrest Vietnam veterans. And the next day, the headline said, vets overrule Supreme Court. And they were not arrested. At that point, the Justice Department was so embarrassed that they went to the court to rescind the rule against them sleeping there. And of course, another thing you may have seen, if you've seen news footage of Dewey Canyon, is the vets have to they're throwing their medals back, and they have to throw it over this big wire fence. The government had actually erected a big wire fence around the Capitol to protect itself from its own veterans. At this point, you would say, you know, people should realize something is wrong. If a government is afraid of its own veterans, what's it doing? It must not be doing something quite right. So those veterans, the Vietnam veterans, what they eventually found out was that the only people they could rely on for help were themselves. I mean, again, you people in this room know that. It wasn't the government, it wasn't the population wasn't there. Vietnam veterans had to look to one another to find the help that they needed for this healing. As a result of that, the Vietnam Veterans Movement was born, and I believe it was the biggest grassroots political movement, or one of the biggest grassroots political movements in United States history. It's still going on. It's still alive today. Different actions, different causes are involved. Vietnam veterans had a lot to do with the normalization of relations with Vietnam. It was Vietnam veterans who pushed for that all along, before anybody else was pushing for that. Vietnam veterans are still pushing for additional Agent Orange diseases to be compensated. So the movement is alive and well, and not only that, but it has helped millions of people around the world. And a lot of people don't really realize that. But for example, the research that was done on delayed stress, initially it was applied to veterans, but the theory behind it and the understanding of it has now been applied to anybody who was a victim of a traumatic occurrence, witness of a traumatic death, victims of rape, people who were involved in floods and tornadoes. You don't have to be a Vietnam veteran to have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was the work that was initiated, pushed, and in large part done by Vietnam veterans themselves that created that body of stress theory that got a definition of delayed stress into the diagnostic and statistical manual, the Bible of psychology. It was not there and wouldn't have been there if Vietnam veterans hadn't pushed for that, and that is now helping people all over the world because of the understanding of that, that if you go through a traumatic experience, you do relive it for years afterward. Another great body of work that has helped is the work that was done on Agent Orange, because when the first Agent Orange lawsuit was filed, Victor Yannicone is here with us tonight, who filed it. There was very little understanding of the toxic chemicals that were in so-called, safe household chemicals. And at that time, the defoliants that were used in Vietnam were also used here as weed killers and defoliants in the United States. The work on exposing the toxicity of dioxin, exposing the fact that chemical companies often produce these products to make lots of money without letting the public know about the dangerous contaminants. That work has led to a whole field of environmental studies, looking at a whole range of toxic chemicals that we're exposed to every day. The issue of dioxin is still a huge issue in the United States and all over the world. They say people that are living in American cities now are getting an unacceptable level of dioxin in their bodies. There's still too much contamination from that. Paper mills, any products that produce chlorinated chemicals are also producing dioxin, and we're getting this into our bodies all the time. But the understanding of that would not have come had not Vietnam veterans been pushing on that issue of Agent Orange, which at the time and for many years the government kept saying was harmless. didn't hurt anybody. And Vietnam veterans had to keep saying, look, we're dying, we're sick, something is wrong, something happened to us there, to force people to pay attention to that. The amount of work that was to be done when Vietnam veterans came back, it was vast. As all of you know, there were many aspects of it. The GI Bill for returning vets was horrendously poor and horrendously low. The first vets who came back, I think the GI Bill was, education was like $100 a month, flat. There was no fee for, you know, the World War II veterans had gotten their tuition paid plus a living stipend. If they could get into Harvard, they could go to Harvard. Vietnam vets were given $100 and said, here, do what you can with it. One of the reasons for that was Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't want to admit to the country that he was fighting a full-fledged war. To have given a very expensive GI Bill would have been a red flag to the country that there was a real war going on. So Johnson made sure the benefits were really low. And so from that point on, even though there were Vietnam veteran activists fought over and over again to increase that bill, but the increases started from such a low point that they never really caught up. That was one issue. The issue of bad paper discharges was another. It was an unpopular war. There were lots of disciplinary problems. For whatever reasons, guys were getting in trouble. Guys were refusing orders because they were tired of seeing their friends getting killed on what seemed like, you know, meaningless patrols or whatever. There was lots of insubordination, and lots of guys were threatened with court-martial, and to avoid it just took what's called bad paper discharges. Bad conduct discharges. They didn't realize at the time when they got back to this country that that was going to be a big stigma. It was going to be hard to get jobs. It was going to be hard to get educational loans. Those bad paper tags followed them around. And an awful lot of work went into trying to get reversal, amnesty for those veterans. Never happened. Jimmy Carter did give amnesty to the draft resistors who went to Canada, but not to unfortunately, there was no blanket reversal of all those bad discharges, and that's still an issue that a lot of veterans have had to live with. Obviously, another major problem was drugs. Vietnam was a drug war. It was a drug time, the 60s. Drugs were readily available in Vietnam. Lots and lots of guys came home with drug problems. The government did almost nothing about it. I remember talking with Bobby Waddell about that because he had gotten onto heroin in Saigon. He said you could get, you know, an ounce of it for $2 or something. And of course, he came home and he couldn't get the same stuff when he got here. And I asked Bobby, I said, well, what did the government do for you? And he said, oh, they put me through their detox program. I said, what was that? He said, they locked me in a room for a week without drugs. That was the program, and then sent me home. Well, obviously, that didn't cure anybody's drug problems. And this is something that a lot of vets have lived with. A lot of them have died with it. And certainly I know vets who've died of drug overdoses later in life or are still suffering with addictions. These were all problems that veterans themselves had to tackle. And the number of people that went out to work on this issue were enormous. I mean, as you know, those of you in this room, there's probably a million hours among all of you of combined work on veterans issues, and yet you're just the tip of the iceberg of the thousands and thousands of good people that worked all around this country. A lot of them were veterans. Some of them were non-veterans. Stuart Feldman was a non-veteran. I believe, Victor, you're a non-veteran. That's right. Victor Yanicone is a non-veteran. Sarah Haley was one of the pioneers of stress theory, post-traumatic stress theory, who died of cancer several years ago, was a non-veteran. So it was not only veterans, but it was veterans in large part that moved it, and sympathetic people that realized what was happening, that somebody had to help as well. What I found and what I felt in writing this book is that so many of these people are heroes, like Lane Evans and like so many of you, and a lot of them are, and a lot of yourselves are unsung heroes because credit was never doled out, and so many people worked thousands and thousands of hours on these issues, and sometimes got little victories. After many years, a bill would be passed, a little bit of compensation would come through, maybe a better jobs program. But it took thousands and thousands of hours just to get those little victories. And there was very rarely credit given. There was very rarely, you know, nobody was celebrating in banner headlines, you know, this veterans advocate gets gets increase in GI Bill. I mean, that was buried in the back pages of the newspapers. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this book that I wrote was to try to give credit to all of the people that are the unsung heroes and that have been working for so many years to make these things happen, to take care of this generation of veterans. I plan to introduce some of them to you tonight, and hopefully everybody or some of the main people here, everybody's a main person, some of the people will get a chance to speak a few words about some of the different issues that were covered. And make no mistake that a lot still does need to be done. Once again, we are seeing the government resist taking care of a generation of veterans, of men and women who went to a war. And I'm speaking now about the Gulf War vets. There were as far as I know, and the Gulf War experts who are here tonight will tell us, but I think there's 125,000 who are sick now. Is that an accurate figure, Dan? About 125,000 Gulf War veterans are very sick. They've been stonewalled by their own government, very much the way that the Vietnam veterans were. As you know, for years the government said Agent Orange didn't hurt anybody. It was harmless. There was some famous colonel who would hold up a teaspoon and say, I could drink it for breakfast. It never hurt me. And of course now the government absolutely admits that Agent Orange did hurt people. But the Gulf War vets are in a very similar situation right now, where they're saying, we're sick, we think we were exposed to toxic substances over there, and the government is saying, no, we don't think you were. It might be in your head. It's almost the same script that was given, that they used when they spoke to Vietnam veterans 20 years ago. The late Senator Alan Cranston, who helped me a great deal with my book, he enunciated this problem, I think, very, very clearly. What Senator Cranston said was, the government seldom backs down when it comes to spending money on national defense. That is always a top priority. But when it comes to spending money on those who have done the job, their priority is always far down the list. And he said, the cost of taking care of veterans has got to be included from the start in any planned budget for military actions. The cost of taking care of the fighters is and should be regarded as an inseparable cost of the fight itself. Unfortunately, our government has not always seen it that way. Today, one of the biggest health issues to have emerged, as I said, for Vietnam veterans is hepatitis C. Not enough is being done on that at all. There has to be more notice put out. I don't care if it's ads in newspapers, if it's spots on television, but Vietnam veterans have to know, if you were in Vietnam during the period of the war, your odds of having hepatitis C are much, much greater than the average population. You should just, automatically go and get yourself tested. But many Vietnam vets I tell about this have no idea, have never heard of this at all. As I said, if Bobby Waddell had been tested sooner, he wouldn't have the critical liver damage that he has right now. That's something the VA really has to look at right now. Thanks to the work of congressmen like Lane Evans, a lot of compensation was achieved. And one of the things that Lane Evans was responsible for is, I believe, the Spina Bifida bill. Am I correct? That was the first bill, the first time the VA had agreed to compensate the children of veterans ever, as far as I know, and saying that any Vietnam veteran whose child has spina bifida can claim compensation, can claim that as a war wound. We do know that probably a lot of other birth defects are attributable to Agent Orange. Those are not compensated, and they should be. The issue of women's cancers has never really been dealt with. There's like about 12, I'm not sure how many, 13 diseases that are now compensated as due to Agent Orange. But there were nurses in Vietnam, 7,500 nurses. I've interviewed many of them. I've talked to many of them. Many of them have uterine cancer. They have had breast cancer. Many of them have had children with birth defects. But there are many specific women's cancers that are not covered at all. These people who were nurses over there did tremendous service, experienced some of the worst aspects of the war, and they've been totally forgotten about in the Agent Orange issue. And obviously, there are many, many more cancers and diseases that should be compensated before it's too late, before all the Vietnam veterans had passed away. One of the speakers we're going to have tonight will be Dan Fahey, who's a Gulf War veteran and co-founder of the National Gulf War Resource Center. And he's going to talk about the issue of Gulf War syndrome, another issue that really needs work, that the government really has to stop stonewalling and take a strong hand and help these veterans. Finally, I'd like to answer a question that keeps getting asked of me. Why did I spend 12 years writing one book? To answer that, I'm going to read one page from a wonderful new novel by Danny Laterras the veteran who can't be here tonight because of heart problems. It just came out. It's called 613 West Jefferson. And I think that on this one page, he answers pretty much of why I wrote this book. In this scene that I'm going to read to you, there's two young guys. It's about 1970. They're living together in a halfway house, and they discover for the first time that each one is a Vietnam veteran after they witness the sudden death of a mutual friend. I'm just going to read one page from Danny's book. They've just discovered a mutual friend who's died. That's how it used to happen in country, Julian murmured. Suddenly there was death. Yeah, in country. You've been to Nam. Army, you? Marine Corps. Yeah, Julian said. Sometimes they just wouldn't be around anymore, like Paisley. I don't know which was worse, to see them get wasted or feel their non-existence. What outfit were you with? 187th Infantry Battalion, Alpha Company. Then you saw action. Yeah, and you? 1st Recon, 1st Marine Division. Julian acknowledged the unit's combat reputation. Welcome home, soldier. Yeah, welcome home. How long has it been for you? I've been back a year, plus a lifetime. Does it ever go away? I don't know, my man. It does get better. But I don't think, no, never, never away. I'll take better. Don't worry, you'll get it, in time, I hope. Hell, I don't know. Look at me, I haven't got much better. What do I know? I don't know, man, I really don't know. A brief moment passed between them. Do you think there's a right and wrong? Julian nodded. Yeah, like black and white. Then forgive yourself. I'm trying, man, I'm trying. There's good and bad in everything. Don't try to figure it out, man. I'm not. I can't. Life is short and the war is over for you and me. Santo didn't know if he really believed in what he just said about the war, but he repeated it to himself anyway. He'd seen the dead. He'd been dead. He'd eaten his last meal and smoked his last cigarette, prepared to be dead. He looked into the bright sky and felt the mortality of it all, but he also felt the need to make his life count, even if nothing mattered anyway. That's Danny Laterras. And I think in that page he said it all. The hurt of the war never really ends, but the desire to make something good out of it all, something that makes some good out of the hurt, the desire to put meaning into that experience persists too. Thank you. Before I start introducing our august list of speakers, I do want to mention we couldn't sell any books here tonight because it's the government property. But I will be appearing around and doing some book signings in town. So let me just tell you where I'm going to be next week at a few bookstores. Tuesday, April 24th, I'll be at Trover Books. That's on Capitol Hill, I guess, right here, 221 Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. Wednesday, April 25th, I'll be at Reprint Books. That's lunchtime also, 12:30, 455 L'Enfant Plaza. Did I say that right? Southwest. And Wednesday evening, I'll be at a place called Vertical Books. That'll be the actual book party for the book in College Park, Maryland, 7346 Baltimore Avenue. And that's 7 p.m. Next Wednesday, the 25th. So I'm going to bring up a few people to speak now who are among us, who are some of the heroes, to say a few words. Okay. Thank you for coming, Congressman. I'd like to start by bringing up Randy Barnes, who was one of the VVAW leaders and then became one of the leaders of VVA, which is Vietnam Veterans of America, which is kind of carried on the work in many different areas. So Randy will tell you about that, a few words.
Well, I wouldn't really say that I was a leader of anything. I just happened to be in a certain place at a certain time. In fact, there's a lot of people in this room who are mentioned on a lot more pages than I am in that book. But I do want to take the opportunity to thank Jerry for writing this book. It was a book that really needed to be, a story that really needed to be told. There are a lot of folks that did a lot of hard work and are still doing hard work to help veterans. God bless them in their work. Jerry, God bless you for writing this book. There's a lot of people who deserve a lot of recognition that never got it, and you do that in this book, and thanks very much.
And this is a real pleasure for me. I'm going to introduce Jan Berry, who is the man who founded Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which was the very first Vietnam veteran organization. In a way, you could say this man began the whole Vietnam veterans movement. Jan Berry.
This feels like the Army, standing around so long. I wish people would sit down if you want to, because I couldn't take it any longer. That first demonstration I went to in New York City, I wore a suit and tie much like this, and a tan raincoat. I think I still have the raincoat. We're back to another era in which we're still, I think, working against stereotypes. Who would think that there's a bunch of radicals in this room who changed several different things about this society? And we're still doing it. I'm amazed that Jerry spent more time writing this book than most of us spent trying to organize those various parts of the campaign, because we kept burning out. And you must have burned out a couple of times. Congratulations for putting it all together, for putting so many different pieces of this puzzle into one book, which hopefully people will begin to get an appreciation for how no one person could possibly have done any of this. People carried on when each of us couldn't do what we tried to do, and somebody else found a way to do it. There were so many other people who over the years have just wondered what happened to them, where did they go in their lives. I hope that out of that experience they found peace with the experience that left us all so bitter, and that they found some other various quieter ways to make a difference in society. I work as a news reporter in New Jersey. I run into Vietnam veterans all the time, including the school superintendent recently who said, I have never talked about it, I cannot talk about it, and he hit his heart like this. So I have always felt from the beginning of what I have done that I have a responsibility to be a speaker for many people who feel that they just cannot possibly say it for various reasons. It's so hard to talk about many people's experiences. And it took me the longest time to figure out how to deal with being scared to death to get up in public and speak. And so I applaud all of you who do this here in the arena with all these lights. And thanks again, Jerry.
Now I'm going to introduce a man named Bill Crandall, who led a 90-mile-long search and destroy mission. It wasn't in Vietnam, it was in the United States, between Morristown, New Jersey, and Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Bill Crandall.
No, I never would have attempted that in Vietnam, believe me. 30 years this week since we threw our medals in. We didn't intend to throw them away. Our plan was to go up on the steps of the Capitol and offer them back to Congress. And nobody came out. And when nobody came out, then we threw them. Said, okay for you. That's the deal. If you had said to me back then that I would have spent most of my adult life representing veterans, advocating for veterans, I would have said, oh, no way, I'm not. And I've had the good fortune to have a number of opportunities to be helpful, including working for Elaine Evans recently, which was something. I'm now having a chance to help veterans who are disabled, service-connected veterans who either have their own businesses or need employment in such businesses. And I'm finding that a really fascinating effort. It's surprising how many people think that we're too old a bunch of fogies to be interested in employment. Might as well not count on that anymore. Wrong. There's a lot to be done. I don't know if it ever goes away. I'm only 58. I've had the honor, and this is such a time, to be in a company of heroes. And I just want to say about this book, I've had the chance to read it. It's a terrific piece of work, Jerry. And I hope it does extremely well. It's a story that's in some ways a perfect companion to the story of the war itself. There's a lot of ugly, stupid stuff in it. There's a lot of bad behavior by people in government whose responsibility it was to behave well. And there are a lot of people doing brave things to tell the truth and to get the case across. Pleased to be here with everyone.
I'd like to bring up Peter Mahoney, who was one of the original Vietnam Veterans Against the War people, who was also indicted by the United States government for his work as a Vietnam veterans activist. Pete?
Well, actually, I wasn't one of the original members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Actually, I didn't join the organization until probably 1971. I'd like to thank Jerry for writing this book. I mean, clearly it's a book that's a lot more than just about the organization Vietnam Veterans Against the War. But this was an organization that whose history had not really been told until this book. And you know, I haven't had a chance to read the whole book. I got one of the sort of unproofed galleys on Monday. And of course, the first thing I did was go to the Gainesville chapter and read that one first. But then I went back and I've gotten through the first 3 chapters so far, and I can say, Jerry, that, you know, you got it right, I think. And, you know, we could quibble about details, you know. I mean, you gave me an extra 3 inches of height. I like that, you know. Which I could have used that when I was on a basketball court. You know, my friend Danny didn't like the fact that he thought you know, you described him as 300 pounds, and he said he never topped 275. You know, but, you know, there were some places where I thought, you know, well, you know, that's not how I remembered it happened. And there were a couple of places where I said, well, gee, something happened there that should have been in the book, you know. I'll tell you, one of the things I learned from Gainesville, I remember the first time that, you know, the lawyer sort of sat the 8 defendants down, and they were trying to, like, what the hell happened here, you know? I mean, let's, you know, give us the story, you know, what happened at this alleged meeting at which this great conspiracy was hatched. You know, and so we went around the room, and each guy gave his version of what happened at the Gainesville meeting. And it was like we attended 8 different meetings, you know? And so that, I mean, history is a matter of personal perception, I think. And I think we all have it. And I think that what Jerry has done with this book has been to, he got the big thing right in terms of what we were trying to do. I think that as I started reading some of the books, you know, all these memories started flowing back to me about this time, you know, 30 years ago practically. And, you know, my first reaction was, God, is that who I was? You know, it seemed like so distant and so out of the realm of my reality now. But then the more I started thinking about it, the more I started realizing that everything that I am today, you know, how I feel, my political beliefs, how I act, the types of work that I choose to do, all really stem from that experience in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. I mean, VVAW was kind of like a shooting star that kind of shot across the horizon real quick and burned real bright for a short period of time. And then, although the organization itself continued on for a very long time, it kind of faded after a while. And, you know, a lot of sectarianism, a lot of crazies, a lot of rampant PTSD going on in that organization. And, you know, you can look at that two ways. On the one hand, you can say, well, gee, there was all that potential that was lost. But then I look at it another way. You know, I look at all the guys from VVAW who then took their experience from that organization and then went on and was able to apply it in a number of different situations in the future. I look at all of the major Vietnam veteran issues that we've all been struggling with over so many years. Virtually every single one of them was identified by and work begun by Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So whatever happened to the organization itself, I think that the legacy lives on. I'd just like to say one more thing. You know, Vietnam veterans are basically members of the baby boom generation. You know, we're the guys who were born in that orgy of baby making from all the guys who came back from World War II. And I think that this baby boom generation is a revolutionary generation, not revolutionary in this sort of old 60s leftist kind of way, but in this regard. We are the first generation in history that has grown up with the power to totally destroy the world. Okay? Nuclear holocaust, environmental holocaust, however it is. We have that power. We are the generation that is going to have to decide what we do with that power. If we make the wrong decisions, there ain't going to be no more generations to correct our mistakes. It's always been my feeling that Vietnam veterans are the leaders of that generation. Okay? Our children, our country, our world require that leadership now. Maybe it's not leadership as Vietnam veterans. Maybe it's leadership as citizens whose perspective is informed by their Vietnam experience. But our leadership is needed. And I would say, let's not shirk our responsibility. Thank you.
I'd like to bring up former Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska. I told him a story on the phone when I talked to him for the first time a few days ago. I said, you kept me from living in Canada. And he said, how did that happen? And I said, well, at the time, I was 1971, I got out of college with a very low draft number, and I was very much feeling the war was wrong, morally wrong, that I could not be a part of it, trying to figure out what do I do with that, go to prison, go to Canada. My best friend went up to Canada and said, you know, forget about prison. You have a life to live, too, no matter what this government is doing. So I was going to go to Canada, and then when I got out of college in June of 1971, a kind of minor miracle happened. The draft law expired, and for the first time in history, it wasn't immediately renewed, which everything had been rubber stamped pretty much to support the war up till that point. Significantly, this was two months after the Vietnam veterans had come to Washington, April of 1971. Suddenly, 2 months later, there was some congressional resistance. I think the veterans speaking out had something to do with that. But anyway, this gentleman I'm going to bring up, Mike Gravel, led a filibuster against the renewal of the draft law, and it could not be renewed. They couldn't draft anyone until they had a new law in place, and they couldn't draft anybody for the rest of the year because of his filibuster, and therefore I didn't have to go to Canada. Mr. Gravel, would you come up, please?
Some people are blessed to sneak through little corridors and little windows, and you're one of them, Jerry. Let me just say that when we talked on the phone, you asked me to share a slight vignette or an anecdote of what had happened at the time. Well, when first off, let me say that the Vietnam veterans' opposition to the war was the group that was the most powerful and the most significant in opposing the war. And for very obvious reasons. They had credentials that no one else had. And so when I received the Pentagon Papers from Dan Ellsberg, who's sitting right over there, I received them on a Friday night. And I held them at my home until Monday morning, at which time I brought them to the Senate. Now, of course, during that period, the entire government was scouring the nation or the world to find Dan Ellsberg. And so I was as frightened as anybody else, and so I didn't really know what was going to happen because I had purchased 2 of these flight bag satchels to put the papers in, and I physically carried them to the Senate. So what I did is, not knowing what the government would do or what the government knew, I contacted the leadership, and I don't know if it could have been any one of these gentlemen here because I just don't recall. I contacted the leadership of the Vietnam vets and said, look, I need a favor. And of course, I had some credentials with them in opposing the war and had met Captain Carey at the time. And I said, I need a favor. What I need is I need the most infirm veterans you have to come and guard my Senate office Senate office, which was at the end of a corridor in the Dirksen building. And so there was no question to ask why or what. They showed up that morning and in their wheelchairs just blocked off that end of the corridor. And of course, the Capitol Police didn't really know what was going on, but because they were vets and had their decorations and their uniforms and obviously their infirmities showing, nobody bothered them. But they guarded the office. And they didn't know why. I then went to the floor with the papers and then attempted to enter them in a record, failed in that because of some machinations on the floor, came back to my office, but by then, everybody knew I had the papers. And as I walked down the hall, it will stay with me the rest of my life. These fellows in their wheelchairs threw their hands in the air and said, go for it, Senator, we're with you. And it was just a very moving experience that they knew then what it was all about and what their cause was all about. So I wanted to share that vignette with you. But I want to touch on something that I think is considerably more important than just that vignette. And that is this book. What this book represents and should never have had to be written. Because the fact that it had to be written was a tragedy, a national tragedy. And why was it a national tragedy? Because this great nation of ours, with its delinquent leadership, did not have the moral wherewithal to stand up and say, we have made a national mistake. And when human beings fail to grasp the depths of their morality to admit error, they are denied the catharsis of moral improvement. And to this day, our nation lacks that improvement that was possible by admitting the error. And it was covered up by what we did to our brave Americans and what we did for a generation to the nation of South Vietnam and North Vietnam in punishing them because they would not acquiesce in their civil war. And so our great nation will never rise to the full height of its greatness until we acknowledge when we do things right, which is very easy, and when we do things wrong, which is very difficult. Thank you.
Well, there's been a lot of talk of Pentagon Papers, so I think it's time. We've got 2 gentlemen here who were indicted for making those papers public to the world. Dan Ellsberg, would you come up? And we're going to have Tony Russo follow you.
Thank you very much. I think that what Senator Gravel has said comes down to is this. There shouldn't be any Vietnam veterans. There should never have been any Vietnam veterans. But in any country, it takes a while to learn something. In the course of making a mistake, some people die for those mistakes day by day by day. What is for sure is there should not be 3 million Vietnam veterans. There should not be 2 million Vietnam veterans or 1 million or 500,000. And the fact that there are that many veterans, and I'm not just talking about the people who are on the wall, whose names are on the wall, is a sign of a moral failure, a failure of courage by almost every institution in our society. And a great many of the parents of these men and their ministers and their preachers and their congresspersons and their newspapers who let that go on long after it was apparent that from any point of view, left, right, or center, these people were dying for a mistake, that a mistake had been made, to say the least. I'm saying you could say that, I would say that it was wrong from the start. From this time, we didn't intervene in a civil war. There was no civil war in 1945, and there was no civil war in 1950. There was a French attempt at colonial reconquest, which failed, and we supported it from the beginning and heavily from 1950. That's not the baby boom generation. That's our fathers and mothers who did that. And the word betrayal of our ideals, betrayal of these veterans, betrayal of everything, and betrayal of our country is not too strong a word, but it's so loaded a word. Let me get away from it. Let me just say the people who went over there were let down, shamefully, let down by people they had a right to trust. Those baby boomers, the veterans, who were the parents, fathers of this generation, did not take the time in terms of their children's welfare to look in, to get beyond the shallow, unthinking notion that this was a war like the one they'd fought in, a war against fascism, a war against aggression. I went, therefore you should go. I'll be ashamed in front of my neighbors and my church and community and everything else if my son doesn't go. These are the kinds of things that sent people over there, as I found. And as the war went on, when I was in Vietnam and when I came back from Vietnam, I more and more began to think this generation of parents has let down. The word betrayal was in my mind. These people, for letting them do this without looking into the differences between this war and World War II, and for that matter, Korea. Now, I came in, I was a Marine at the end of the Korean emergency. I didn't go to Korea. I was in peacetime in the Marines, and I got a more generous GI Bill, which I used in my graduate work when I came back, than anybody got for fighting in Vietnam, ever. That was another shame. Again, a kind of betrayal, but let's again say let down. I couldn't understand it. These people are veterans. How can they possibly turn their back and allow the kind of conditions that my close friend Ron Kovic describes in his book, Born on the 4th of July, and lives with to this day? Incredibly shameful and grungy conditions in the veterans' hospitals. How could that be? And then the Agent Orange disgrace. I was fairly disillusioned with my government that I had served in by the time Agent Orange began to be, the effects of that began to be known. But I was astonished. I could not believe that this country, with its sense of patriotism defined by service in the military, defined by war to a large extent, like many countries, how they could hide and lie, not just about what they'd done to all the rest of us and to the taxpayers and to everybody in the country, lied us into the war, lied 58,000 to death. How could they be lying about the suffering of veterans who came back, hiding it so that they didn't want to admit a mistake, they didn't want to take on that tax burden, money for attack submarines, money for SDI, but not money. I really could not have predicted that that would happen. But you could still say, well, what should we learn about our country? I guess if you're in a lost war, too bad, you know, you're going to have it tough. But we've been hearing about the Gulf War, the victorious war, the one we're not ashamed of, the one where the great victory parades went, and they are still lying and refusing to pay the people who suffered from that. They don't want to admit the costs of that war because it might discourage people a little from the next one so much. You gave me a little something to think about tonight. I got hepatitis in Vietnam, as a matter of fact, and spent a year recovering from that. I don't know if it was hepatitis C, and maybe I better look into that. Tony, as a civilian, as I was over there, was in the field, might, as a result of your advice, go back for that. He certainly won't get any benefits for it, I'm sure. But something comes back to me is that Tony Russo, at the Rand Corporation, when he came back, wrote, to my knowledge, perhaps the first study, classified study, of the effects of the herbicide campaign, showing, by the way, that it was not, as they claimed, simply protecting Admiral Zumwalt's son by clearing away brush from the sides, but it was, quote, food denial to women, children, and food denial by poisoning the women and children directly, not just by taking away the foliage. That remained classified. I think you told me the other day, Tony, as far as you know, it's still classified. Is that true? Hasn't been released? maybe now, 30 years later. But anyway, he was essentially, is fired, the wrong word, but he was let go by the Rand Corporation for discovering these unwelcome truths, and also the truths of torture by our allies, the people we paid in Vietnam. So, as we say, even if you win a war over here, what is it? Frankly, I don't have the answer on this one. It's a kind of meanness which, if you read Mary McGrory's column today about the policies of this administration, you'd say, well, it's the Scrooge kind of Dickensian mentality that is characterizing our economy today, or our government. But this happened under Democrats, under everybody. And let me now finally pay tribute to some of the people who showed the kind of courage lacking in so many others, and kept there from being more than 3 million and more than 58,000. I'll bet, one fast thought, you've all seen the Vietnam Memorial. It just recently occurred to me, a little fact, why that thing is symmetrical aesthetically, the way it is. You know, it's chronological, so it starts with a small number of deaths way back, and it gradually gets deeper and deeper till you get to 1968, where we lost almost 15,000, and then it goes down after 68, but it goes down symmetrically. It goes down at the same rate that it built up. As many people, more than half, died after the Tet Offensive, when the majority of the American people saw this is a stalemate and began to say this war is immoral to continue. More died after the Tet Offensive, almost 10,000 after the Tet Offensive in the course of 68. But how many people here realize as many Americans died after 68, from 69 on, as before 68? That's why the memorial is a bat-wing shape that is symmetrical. Why doesn't it go like this and then down? There shouldn't have been one name on that memorial, many more after, from 69, when a new administration came in. But that's not the way it is. Without people who were saved, like Nicosia, right here today, by Senator Gravel, with his filibuster, there would be that many more names and that many more people on the memorial. Gravel, and I want to come back to this, I learned later, was showing the kind of courage that he'd gotten in a very traditional way, to some degree, at least from veterans. And it was not an accident that it was veterans who took the initiative and the possible scorn of their countrymen by casting away these honored prized possessions of their medals. They were showing the best tradition, let's say, of what they'd been trained. Let me give one other example of that. I remember running I admired John Kerry very much for his work at the beginning of that. I ran into him in the LA airport. No, I was at San Francisco airport. I was coming from somewhere, and he was coming from Vietnam, it turned out. I'll tell you when it was the transition period between the election of Clinton and the defeat of George Bush Sr. So it was a couple of months in between there. And I knew that I said, where are you coming from, John? He said, well, I've just been to Vietnam. And I think he'd been there with McCain, who was another veteran, very prisoner, very creditably trying to, at last, end the war against Vietnam, as Tony puts it. Establish peace, recognize Vietnam. So I said to John, gee, I want to congratulate you. You know, you're doing, that's terrific work, really, to step out like that. He said, but come on now, Bush has lost the election. He's not going to run again. Clinton, with the anti-war record, not a veteran, is going to have he can't just come right in and establish relations with Vietnam. So it's going to be delayed for a long time, as it was. I mean, to his credit, I'll give Clinton credit. And with McCain's help and others, he did eventually change relations. But it's obviously going to take long. So I said, why doesn't Bush, with a stroke of the pen, do that? He's a lame duck. What can it cost him? And Kerry said, I don't know if he minds being quoted on this or not, but I'll say he doesn't have the guts to do it because he's afraid that he would get demonstrations, small demonstrations against him, maybe of veterans, if he did it. I said, well, a small demonstration that he's going to get somewhere, that's a reason for prolonging this war that long? He says, well, didn't have it. Now, does that distinguish George Bush Sr. as a particular coward? No. Business as usual, I'm sorry to say. The exception is a Gravel, the exception is a Kerry, and they showed the same the same courage when Kerry's throwing his medal over, and then later when he's taking the point on reestablishing relations, as they showed in their military training. It was a credit to their military training. I'll sum it up this. In fact, Gravel said to me later, I asked him on the phone. I only met him much later. But on the phone, I said, I was underground when he was actually putting this out. And I said, how did you come to do this? And he said, well, I was in officer candidate school about the same time I was. He was in the Army, I was in the Marines in the 50s. And he was in a platoon leader's course, as I was. I don't think you've ever said this publicly too much, but he told me this. And I imagine he knew I'd been in the Marines. And he said, we wore in the Army, we didn't do this in the Marines, a patch that said, follow me on it. Platoon leader's slogan, which gets platoon leaders killed in greater numbers than any other officers, or more than almost anybody else. And he said, I told my staff, Dan Ellsberg, I was underground at the time, Dan Ellsberg is out in that field. He said this is the nightmare of a platoon leader, that he'll say, follow me, and he'll go charge, and then he looks back and nobody's there. Which is true, I remember that. And he said, Dan Ellsberg is out in that field, and I don't want him to be alone. I want to join him. The upshot of all this is, other generations of young men, and now young women more and more in the military, and our country, and people we kill over there, will be betrayed in the same way unless more people in Congress and the press and the church and the courts and the White House and everywhere else do as the people I've described, begin to apply the same standards of courage that to their civilian activity, their political activity, when their government is going wrong and when a mistake has been made, activity against our leadership, as they or their sons are routinely expected to show in salute to the leaders, no matter how mistaken, in combat, in the military. Unless we say the courage is not just something for the people we send over there at 18 and 19, not knowing the political background, but it's something that we as parents and as congressmen, as everybody else, it's up to us to take a few risks and show some courage, even against the commander-in-chief. That will, let us just end on a positive note, preserve the honor of this country.
One of the things I really wanted to do tonight is to present the situation of Gulf War veterans. We have Dan Fahey, who came down here from Massachusetts, even though he's studying for an exam. I'd like to bring Dan Fahey up, who's one of the great Gulf War activists, to talk about the situation of Gulf War vets. Dan?
Thank you, Jerry. I'll keep it brief, but I got involved in this issue. After I got out of the Navy, I started working at Swords to Plowshares Veterans Rights Organization, which some of you probably know is founded by Michael Blecker, Jack McCluskey, and some other guys who were very active in helping vets after the war. And initially, I was actually employed under the Agent Orange Class Assistance Program for about 2 years, helping veterans with disability claims. And while I was doing that, we were getting contacted by more and more Gulf War veterans. And oftentimes, it was actually a family member or a boyfriend or a girlfriend saying, you know, this person's having health problems. And I started looking into it, and what I found was that there were small groups forming all over the country. This is probably very similar to, you know, what Jerry describes in the book here, but small groups forming, trying to help, it's veterans helping veterans. And in many cases, a lot of these veterans were actually having a lot of health problems themselves, but were sacrificing a lot to find out what was making people sick, and then also coming here to Washington to try to get things done. And Congressman Evans has been one of the biggest friends of Gulf War vets. In '93, he helped get a bill passed that provided money for research on depleted uranium, which is one of the suspected causes. But we really had to fight for a long time, not only to get the government to acknowledge that vets were sick, but to acknowledge that it wasn't just stress. You know, a lot of vets in the early '90s were going into the VA, reporting health problems, and for many people, the VA's response was to give them Prozac and send them home and try and pretend like that was the end of the problem. But I'd like to acknowledge Paul Sullivan, who's here today. one of the leaders of the Gulf War Veterans Movement, he and some other people, using the Freedom of Information Act, obtained documents that showed that, in fact, Gulf War vets were exposed to low levels of chemical agents released during the bombing campaign. And it took 5 years for the Pentagon to admit that actually people had been exposed. They repeatedly lied. They set up committees that wrote reports saying there's no evidence that anyone was exposed to chemical agents. And finally, 1996, it started with about 500 were exposed. Then it was 1,500. Then it was 5,000. Then it was 20,000. And now, just from one single incident, it's about 100,000. And it was a similar story with depleted uranium. After the war, it took 2 years before the government finally acknowledged there's a problem here. And initially, the military told the VA there was 33 vets exposed. So they set up a program, they put 33 vets in. Well, it took us until 1998 to get the Pentagon to admit that actually thousands of people had been exposed, but yet they're continuing a study of only 51 guys. It was the last time they looked at it. And actually in 1999, of these 51, one had lymphoma and one had a bone tumor out of 51. And what's really interesting about this is that this is a weapon that's continuing to be used. So in January of this year, when this became a big controversy because of the use of depleted uranium in the Balkans, the Pentagon sent spokesmen over to NATO, and these guys got up and said, there have been no cancers among the vets in our study. And at the time, the way I actually found out that one of these guys had lymphoma was through the internet. And you know, a lot of this has changed. We've taken advantage of a lot of the technological changes to advance the cause of Gulf War vets. But through the Pentagon's own website, I found a document saying one of these guys had cancer. So they're continuing to lie about the causes of Gulf War vets' illnesses. And there's about 125,000 men and women who have taken the medical examinations for Gulf War vets who are reporting health problems. And this is a problem that really is continuing. And you know, a lot of the vets who were active in making this happen really benefited directly from people in this room and from Vietnam veterans. You know, we got legislation passed in 1998. That was 7 years after the war. And it wouldn't have happened without the trail that was blazed by a lot of Vietnam vets, by the activism, and unfortunately by the deaths and illnesses that a lot of people had to suffer to get the government to acknowledge what was happening. So I'd like to thank everyone in this room for really making this happen. And you will be glad to know that a lot of the Gulf War vets who've been active are still active. Some are actually trying to end the war. You know, we like to think that the war ended in 1991, but you know, the fact that we have permanent bases and that we're flying combat missions over 2/3 of that country ever since then really shows us the war has not ended. And there are also Gulf War vets who are continuing to work to try to end or at least significantly reform the sanctions so that the people who rose up against Saddam Hussein after the war don't have to continue to suffer. So I'd like to really thank everyone, and actually I want to specifically thank Jerry, because in 1995, when there was the first national meeting of Gulf War veterans, I was working at Swords. We were having, you know, as with a lot of nonprofits and vets groups, trouble with funding, and Jerry provided me with the ticket to fly to Dallas, Texas for that first meeting of Gulf War vets, out of which formed the National Gulf War Resource Center, which made the legislation in 1998 happen. So I'd like to thank all of you, and particularly Jerry Nicosia, and for writing this book and including a chapter on the Gulf War vets. And I hope when you all read it, you'll realize that despite all of the shortcomings that have happened and all the things you went through, that your efforts not only help Vietnam vets, but they also help Gulf War vets. Thank you.
Now I'd like to bring up a man who came down here from New York, and I'm sorry, Vic, it's getting late and lots of people are going, but I want to bring up Victor Yannicone, because if you don't know him, you should know him. He's known as the father of environmental law. This is the man that brought the first DDT lawsuits, the man who filed the Agent Orange lawsuit, the man who made the whole country aware of what was done to Vietnam veterans chemically. Victor Yannicone, a great, great hero of this world. Thank you.
No, gentlemen, ladies, the heroes are out there. I was just a mouthpiece. There it is. 2378 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, the molecule of death. I was going to be very, very, very short tonight, but Frank McCarthy's in the hospital the second time for a second surgery for lung cancer. His first one was about 18 months ago. Those of you that are familiar with the progress of lung cancer know that is not a good sign. I'm honored to even be included in this work. This is my copy I got a week ago. All those little flags represent pieces of information that I never knew about. I never fully understood the sacrifice of the veterans that led Frank McCarthy to my driveway on the eve of my wedding anniversary in 1978, where he parked and camped and told me we had to do something about his friend Paul Rudishan. And because I had already done it once with the environment movement in '66, I didn't want to do it again. Once was enough. I told Frank that. And he wouldn't go home. I found him out there the next morning. I went in, talked to my wife, talked to my son, teenager, and my little girl. And they said, find out what he really wants. All right, Frank, here's a pad. Start writing. What do you want to accomplish with this lawsuit? And this is what Frank wrote, only slightly changed to fit the format of the legal paper I presented it in. The veterans want medical care and treatment of their own afflictions, but mostly they want medical care and treatment for the afflictions that have been visited upon their children. The veterans don't want to be recipients of public assistance or welfare. The veterans are taxpayers. They don't believe that the other taxpayers of the United States should bear the burden of the cost of the medical care and treatment they require as a result of the toxic effects of dioxin-contaminated herbicides. The veterans want the people who put the poison in the herbicides to reimburse the American people for what it's going to cost to take care of the sick veterans. The veterans want answers to why the best and bravest of our young men, who were duly certified by at least 1 or 2 medical agencies as the healthiest young men and women in America before they went to Vietnam, had started to die by Christmas of '78 from the diseases of old age. Prostate cancer in men under 40, unheard of. They wanted to put an end to the hype that had been fostered by the Veterans Administration and the chemical companies. And there's a section in here that I never knew about. I never knew that the VA had a private meeting with the herbicide manufacturers to discuss how harmless dioxin was, and that the veterans were all suffering from PTSD. None of them were really sick. It was all in their heads. Frank went on to write, 2.46 million veterans are not a statistically insignificant sample of the American people, considering they were all in good health when they went. Why are they dying? And finally, the veterans are appalled at the lack of concern by the VA for their war. And he said, took out a clipping 8 or 9 years old, and he said, "You once said, if there's something that we need here in America, there has to be a legal way to get it. The lawyer's job is to find it. And if you can't find it, invent it. You're a lawyer. Get off your ass and sue them." We went inside, and I started to type. 186 pages later, with Frank over my shoulder the whole time. Next morning, we had put in one document everything that was then known about dioxin and herbicides and their use in Vietnam. Everything that was public record. It was very simple. I told Judge Pratt, see this molecule? What it does is damage the electron transport system and the oxidative phosphorylation mechanism of cytochrome P450 in your liver. That's why so many veterans have so many disparate illnesses. We now know that's true. No thanks to the VA. Again, because of Jerry's hard work, dedication, and scholarship, I now know that when I said the VA is the most dangerous enemy the Vietnam veteran has faced since he left the Viet Cong in the jungle, I was right. I did make a mistake, though, and I'm going to make a public apology. I blame Max Cleland. I was wrong. It wasn't Max's fault. It was a national tragedy, except for people like Senator Gravel and a few of his allies, and the brave people who stood up, Dewey Canyon and the rest. And I have to leave you with one anecdote. Frank McCarthy said the most important thing we could do was try and restore the dignity of the American fighting man that had somehow been stripped from him by the apathy of his fellow Americans. And on that first day in the courtroom, in a little hole-in-the-wall temporary courtroom in Westbury, there were about 100 veterans from all over the metropolitan area, and many women and many children suffering catastrophic polygenetic birth defects. And Judge Pratt, who was a very tall, very stately man, door opened, and normally the clerk comes out and says, "All rise." He didn't have to. One of the veterans from the 9th Marines in the back of the room, as soon as he saw the door open and saw the judge, said, "Ted, hut!" And to a man, everybody stood up and stood at attention. Judge Pratt walked in and saw at the back of the room one of the veterans from Brooklyn carrying an American flag, standing at attention with an American flag. And the marshals, many of whom were Vietnam veterans, had been alerted by the chemical companies that a group of drug-crazed veterans might attempt civil rebellion there in Westbury. And as soon as they saw that veteran with the flag and all those veterans standing menacingly at attention in their fatigues and their misery, They reached for those briefcases. For those of you that don't know, during that whole period, in those briefcases was a fully loaded automatic weapon, machine pistol. Judge stood there. Marshal, what's the problem? That man has an American flag. And Judge Pratt says, this is an American courtroom. Young man, are you a Vietnam veteran? Yes, sir. The flag stays. And at that moment, Judge Pratt looked at all the women and all the children. And he said, Mr. Yannicone, are these the mothers of the children that you've mentioned in that complaint and described? And I said, yes, sir, they are. He said, the court will take a recess. Marshals, clerks, clear out the 2 jury rooms at the back of the courtroom. They all have bathroom facilities. They all have tables. Ladies, take your babies in there. You can use it as a changing room. You can sit there comfortably. Make sure there are enough chairs for them, clerks. Run speakers in there to make sure they can hear everything. He looked at the rest of the soldiers still standing at attention. He said, gentlemen, stand at ease. We'll be back as soon as the facilities are made ready for you. Court is in recess. The media that photographed that scene had not yet ever seen a federal agency show any real respect for the Vietnam combat veterans. And that was a day that was a lesson for all of us. And that was a tribute to Frank McCarthy's persistence. The rest, as they say, is history. Jerry has told us the whole story in chronological order. He's woven the separate threads into a cloth that everybody has to read. This story must be told every single year to every new generation. And one last remark. Tony Russo's here. In the secret documents, all million frames of them, some of which are in my basement, the rest are safely distributed throughout the country in multiple copies, guarded by Vietnam veterans, waiting for the appropriate moment. They were supposed to be destroyed as part of the Agent Orange settlement. But they forgot I wasn't part of the lawsuit at that moment. No one asked me to destroy mine. So I sent them out instead. Tony's famous memos are in there. They're great memos. That whole collection deserves to be on the internet. Everybody who ever went to Vietnam should read the story. And I'm going to say one thing. The dignity and honor and integrity of the American fighting men, including the generals, is unquestioned from those documents. There is one and only one really evil person. And there will be, as Dante has predicted, a separate circle in hell for that man. Robert McNamara.
Thank you very much. We're going to be evicted in a couple of minutes, so I want Tony Russo to come up and speak to us. As you know, he was Dan Ellsberg's partner in crime, and he seldom gets the credit for it. So here's the co-conspirator finally taking the mic.
I have to say, Victor, that I hope as a good probation officer at that one circle you reserved for Robert McNamara, because let me tell you, I don't care what you think about Robert McNamara. When he came out 5 years ago and said it was wrong, terribly wrong, that was very important. It took a lot of guts, and it had a great impact in circles that most of you don't know, and that is the underground war that has continued. I have two friends who have been assassinated by the old Saigon political terror apparatus that some of you call the GVN, some of you call South Vietnam. Well, before I get too carried away, let me just say first, though, that Jerry in this book has made a contribution. You know, Santayana said not only that if you don't come to terms with history, you're going to have to repeat it, he also said history is rewritten, is miswritten at first. And there comes a time when it has to be rewritten, written for real. And that's what I see happening today, and that's what Jerry's book is part of. The real history of the war which is not over, the war which continues, because even today, American military men will get up on Memorial Day over in the cemetery somewhere and talk about those brave American boys who fought for freedom in Vietnam. Well, let me tell you one thing. The people who fought for freedom in Vietnam were the so-called enemy, the ones we call the Viet Cong, but the ones the peasants call the liberation gentlemen. Let me just say real quick that the anniversary of the Pentagon Papers is coming up at the first day of publication, 13th of June, St. Anthony's Day, right? St. Anthony, the patron saint of lost articles, right? Check it out. The Pentagon Papers, there's going to be a conference. VVA is sponsoring a conference on the Pentagon Papers on June the 5th at the National Press Club. All of you should come. We should have longer than that, but at least we'll have a full day. The Pentagon Papers plus our victory at the trial in Los Angeles is what brought Nixon down. When you hear Watergate, it should be Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers spawned Watergate. Who got caught at Watergate? Who was it? Not that, don't say plumbers. Pentagon Papers investigators. That's who got caught. The Pentagon Papers really exposed American imperialism, and that's what it was, and that's what it is. Attempts to control the world, attempts to control the entire globe, all these different countries. So remember, the Pentagon Papers have to be brought up to date. We have to update the Pentagon Papers. There has been a third Indochina War. You know, the second Indochina War was what we know as the Vietnam War, but is really the American Vietnam War. The third Indochina War has been covered up. Last May, the media talked about the 25th anniversary of the end of the war, but the war didn't end. The war went on, the third Indochina War went on for about 20 more years, until 95. Years in which we collaborated with Pol Pot, years in which we carried out covert actions against the Vietnamese, years in which we had a terror campaign here. Like I mentioned before, I have two friends who were shot by the old Saigon political terror apparatus. Years in which our government, our secret government, carried out psychological warfare against the American people, moved out any discussion of what really happened by talking about the POW MIA issue. And what was that? That was a hoax. That was a hoax. So, brothers and sisters, the war's not over. We are about to enter the fourth Indochina War. Governor Bush and the Vietnamese leadership have recently exchanged harsh and bitter language. There was a Montagnard uprising in the Central Highlands recently linked to the Vietnamese based in the U.S. who still work for our secret government. Our secret government uses them against every liberation movement. You do not train all those pilots, use that expensive training, and then let it go to waste. They're over in Africa, they're in Asia, they're on virtually every continent, flying covert missions. So, brothers and sisters, the war is not over. We need to organize. We need to develop more solidarity than we've had. We have kind of dropped the ball. Let's pick it up again, especially today when our nation is in a crisis. We have no president. Let's get it together. Thank you.
Okay, we're all going to have to vacate. We're about to get evicted here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for holding on to the end. Thank you very, very much for being here and making this a very special occasion for me. Thank you all.
Gerald Nicosia is the author of Home to War, A History of the Vietnam Veterans Movement. It's published by the Crown Publishing Group, which is part of Random House. If you'd like to find out more, visit their website at randomhouse.com. Next weekend, National Public Radio commentator Kevin